Right then, everyone. I think we have enough people online, so I can start. So welcome to this seminar on disability accessible emergency communications, learning from wartime experiences in Ukraine. My name is Peter Lonigan. I'm a senior policy officer at ENA. ENA, of course, is the European Emergency Number Association. It's my pleasure to be here today on behalf of our organization to open this very important topic. For those of you who may be joining us for the first time, ENA is dedicated to improving emergency communication services across Europe. We serve as a platform for emergency services professionals to exchange best practices and address the challenges faced by emergency services. We also engage in advocacy efforts and help other relevant organizations to enhance public safety. And today's webinar is part of our ongoing commitment to facilitate knowledge sharing and professional development within the emergency communications community. And as part of this, we're welcome to have an expert, Philippa Tucker, um, who is a human rights activist from the European Disability Forum, who currently serves as coordinator for Central and Eastern Europe at the organization, representing the rights, of course, of people with disabilities. And she'll be discussing a very important topic, which is how to ensure accessible emergency communications during wartime. As many of you will know, since the start of the Russian war of aggression in 2022, there have been extensive bombing campaigns against civilian infrastructure in cities in Ukraine, in addition, of course, to challenges on the front line. And as you can imagine, that has created a lot of challenges for the Ukrainians. We first met myself and Philippa back in November, just before the EU Law for Emergency Communications event, which we held in December, which I know some people have attended. And what really struck me from discussing the topic with her and from hearing from Ukraine was that at the start of the war, they made the decision to prioritize making sure people with disabilities could be protected during war, because of course they have specific needs which need to be addressed. So I'd really like to thank Ms. Tucker for coming today to discuss this topic. And now, before we hear more, I might just give a few quick housekeeping points, although I know you're all very excited to learn more about this important issue. This webinar is being recorded, and it will be available on our website shortly after the session. So don't worry if you miss some notes. As we're using Zoom, automatically translated captions are available. I understand they might be very useful because I speak very fast. You can find the caption buttons at the top of your screen in Zoom. Click on the arrow as shown, and then under Translate To, you'll find a list of languages that you can view. And to change languages, you just simply follow the same steps again. Before we begin, though, we'd like you to maybe participate in a brief interactive activity using a platform called Slido. And this is just to let us get to know our audience a bit better and see who's attending. So you should see a QR code and a link on your screen. If you scan the QR code with your smartphone camera or visit slido.com and enter the event code ENA, you'll be able to take part in the interactive activity. So for those of you who've done so, the first question is, where are you joining us from today? And you can type your location into the box provided. Maybe share the link in the chat. '27 Route to South. Nice and specific. Perfect. Wow, okay, so all over Europe. Nice diverse audience here today from the four corners of our continent. Right then, if you want, we can move to the next question, I suppose, which is, I believe, what sector are you from? And you can once again type into the box provided, and your responses will appear on the screen. Right then, perfect. So now you're all experts on how to use Slido, which is very positive because during the webinar, if you have any questions, you can use Slido to submit the questions. You can then upvote questions submitted by others. So if someone asks an amazing question, you can upvote it and they'll be asked first. And that'll help us, of course, identify and prioritize the topics of greatest interests. And we'll address all the questions in the end, so don't worry. So That's all our preparatory work done. I've let you wait for long enough, so let's get started. I'm pleased to introduce our speaker, Philippa Tucker, and Tucker, go ahead and share your insights.
All right. Thank you so much, Peter, and thank you to Sana. I hope that you see my screen. Is it working?
We can see your screen. Yeah.
Okay. All right, let's go. So my name is Philippa Tucker, and I'm so happy that I'm not preaching to the choir today. I'm so happy that it's not people inside Ukraine or people inside OPDs. That's usually too often the case with us. And it's fantastic that you're all experts in other sectors than what I do. So this is very, very useful. So I want to discuss with you about disability accessible emergency communications in Ukraine. And I'm going to take some time to explain to you a little bit about my organization first, then about the project, and then finally about what we've seen as persons with disabilities in Ukraine. And I hope it's useful to you in your work. All right. So, about the European Disability Forum, for those of you who might not know us, we're a nonprofit organization, an NGO. We're an advocacy umbrella organization. We have 113 members. That might be the National Forum of Persons with Disabilities in Spain or in Ukraine, or it might be the European Association of People with Spina Bifida or the European Association of Deafblind. So there's two different types of organizations that we have, members that we have, but we also have service providers. So organizations that work to provide services to persons with disabilities. We are an OPD, what we call an OPD, and you might find me use that language during this presentation. It means an organization of persons with disabilities, and it means that the organization is run by persons with disabilities. And why this is important is I like to give the example of gender because it's the most obvious one. If we had an organization of men who were presenting what solutions were necessary for women, it doesn't always make sense, does it? So this is why it's really, really important to have OPDs. We work towards the full implementation of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the UNCRPD. This is the highest legislative commitment on the globe that is aimed at fulfilling the rights of persons with disabilities. Our work is with the European Union, the Council of Europe, the United Nations, and many, many other stakeholders, including the team at ENA. And what we work towards is nothing about us without us. Like I've said to you before, it's important that solutions that are developed for persons with disabilities are done in consultation with persons with disabilities. I have a disability, but I would not know how to solve the immediate problems of somebody with another disability as well as that person would. Okay, so it's important for us to always remember that. So the work in Ukraine, I am fortunate enough to have been working with EDF at the time that we started responding to the war in Ukraine. In February 2022, unfortunately, we had to respond to the enormous number of needs that came through. Working with the neighboring countries, Hungary, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Moldova, Romania, Slovakia, and within Ukraine, working to try and get humanitarian aid, advocacy, inclusion, cash, wheelchairs, all sorts of things through to persons with disabilities who were affected by the Russian war of aggression. Since between February 2022 and April 2025, we've been able to serve more than 70,000 people directly. So we've learned a thing or two through that process because we are not a humanitarian aid organization. But I hope that some of what we learned might be useful to you in your work today. And many, many, many of these people are adults and children with disabilities that we've been working with. And we just want to shout out to CBM International and the German Foreign Federal Office as well for supporting us with those funds. So the first work that we did was called the Phase Project. And this was really about helping refugees moving to the neighboring countries. And a lot of what we did was try and help persons with disabilities moving to the neighboring countries to try and integrate into those new places as they were forced to move, as well as working inside Ukraine. And then Empower Ukraine was the second program that we are running, and I'm the one that's coordinating that. And that is about humanitarian aid. So I don't expect you to know about that, but that's giving people cash, that's delivering wheelchairs, that's assistive technology, uh, and transport to health appointments, training healthcare providers on how to include persons with disabilities in their work, and movement building. So strengthening the movement inside Ukraine. At the moment, it's in 6 provinces, or oblasts, as we call them in Ukraine. And our work is specifically with persons with disabilities, but also any internally displaced persons, veterans, older people, single-headed households, etc. That's a photograph of one of the meetings where people were being handed cash. All right, let's talk about war and disability quickly first. In Ukraine, in 2022-2023, there was an estimated 2.7 million persons with disabilities. By 2025, that number had skyrocketed to between 3 and 3.4 million persons with disabilities. It depends on which data source you use. That means that within 4 years, we have 300,000 to 700,000 new disabilities. Those rates are exceptionally high, but that is the result of a conflict. And I think it's very, very important for us to understand these numbers and internalize them so we understand the need, how it grows exponentially when there is conflict. The second thing I want to draw to your attention that happens under war is war damage to physical and telecoms infrastructure. So in Kiev, the physical infrastructure, from February 22 to December 24, there was 170 billion worth of direct war damage to physical infrastructure. So that really gives us an indication of the amount of damage and destruction that happens in the war context. This is housing, this is telecoms, this is energy, transport, everything. Telecoms alone, we're lucky that the Kyiv School of Economics has done their work, and it's also, we can triangulate it with what the UN, the World Bank is also doing. And between 1.2 and 1.79 billion euros worth of damage has been done to telecoms in that same period. So you can see that these numbers are really, really huge. Why do I give you these numbers? First of all, because it's very easy to think that when conflict arises, we can quickly respond. And it's not necessarily the time to start improving and doing inclusion. In fact, preparedness is key. So actually preparing prior to any kind of event, whether it's climate, whether it's conflict, whatever it might be, is important. Let me talk a little bit about veteran-specific disabilities that result because of war. And these are really, really, really just examples. So we have physical injuries. Let's imagine limb loss from mines or from artillery. And the result is that many of the veterans have their legs or arms amputated. Obviously, this is also happening with civilians in Ukraine. Secondly, we have neurological injuries. We have blast-related brain damage, a traumatic brain injuries that can occur. That's an example that we have. Musculoskeletal damage. So you can have long-term mobility impairment as a result of Shahed strikes or shooting, or you can also have damage to the spine. We see a lot of wheelchair users from these kinds of injuries. And then we've got sensory loss. I'll speak a little bit more in detail about loss of hearing, but it's important for us to understand that there's damage from explosions, that they're very, very loud. And we can also have direct damage to the eyes or to the hearing, and even to the skin through burns. And we have mental health conditions, obviously, that can result. So we have these invisible injuries of war, like PTSD, post traumatic stress disorder, which I'm sure many, many, many of you have heard about, but which results in people having a disability. So during the course of the war to date, we now have 150,000 more veterans with disabilities in Ukraine. Those are the official numbers. All right. So let's imagine now how those disabilities that I just mentioned might just affect emergency communications during wartime. So, physical injuries, we would not want multi-gesture motions in your app or in your process of having those emergency communications. That would be very difficult for somebody with physical injuries who perhaps couldn't move their arm or didn't have fingers. Language like run quickly to the nearest shelter would be deeply problematic for people with physical injuries. The other thing that's important is including opt-in assistance instead of opt-out assistance. So some apps, for example, require people to check in, but they're not necessarily able to. So opt-in assistance for persons with physical injuries is an example of what we would need. Under neurological injuries, for example, the use of plain language, not using terminology or technical terms, prioritizing important information. What do you do first? And then what do you do? And then what do you do? So it's very clear steps. What's the first priority? And then what comes later is very important to people with neurological injuries. Clarity of speech is also very important, and replayability. That means that if a message comes through, that we are able to replay it so that we are able to fully understand what it is. Okay, musculoskeletal damage. Examples would be needing universal design and hands-free options. That would include things like text-to-speech options, and also that alerts or messaging would be available on wearables. So, for example, one of the things that we've done is we've actually given smart watches to persons with disabilities in Ukraine, so that they can get those alerts and then they can message people as well. Okay, sensory loss. Yes, for example, including vibration and not just sound or audio or video is important to people with sensory loss. Having options for SMSs is important for people who cannot speak. Having voice calls for people who perhaps are blind, video calls for people who use sign language, and making sure that sign language is available not just in your local language, but think about foreigners. Think about what other languages might be needed. And maybe international sign language instead of just Ukrainian sign language, for example. And then we have mental health conditions. So this is a very important one that often gets forgotten. We need communications to be variable. That's very important so that the tones, the volume, the wording is sensitive and inclusive, and most importantly, personalized. So that somebody perhaps who has PTSD as a result of being a veteran, being at the war front, and who is triggered by perhaps loud noises, can turn down the volume of his alert, can perhaps personalize it to a different voice that maybe is more suitable to their situation. Okay, time for you to do some work. So I gave you some examples of inclusiveness. But overall, there's one principle that I've spoken about, which is the best way to ensure inclusiveness. What do you think that might be? You can write it in the chat. I don't think anybody has the possibility to open their mics. I don't know, Peter, but you can all just write it in the chat and we can see what the comments are there.
If anyone wishes to speak, you can raise your hand and I can give the floor to you.
Thanks, Anna. That's amazing. Okay, I don't see the chat in my view, so perhaps Anna, you can read it for me.
So we have a few
There you go.
options. One is to offer different communication channels. Another is personalization, which I suppose in some ways is similar to make sure there's a different channel for each kind of person's individual needs.
Nice. I see that. Fantastic. All right. I see something else. Inclusiveness. Yes. What other ideas do we have? What is the best way? There's one overarching principle that might help you to ensure inclusiveness. And I see there's some nice resources being dropped in the chat. Fantastic. So the principle that we should have is to include persons with disabilities. The easiest, most effective way is to kind of, what one of the persons says is meet people where they are. Go and discuss with organizations of persons with disabilities and ask them what they need. You might find that in one area or a different area or one group of persons with disabilities or another group of persons with disabilities would give you fantastic ideas, great solutions, etc., etc. So ask persons this. Hortus has got it right to include persons with disabilities in the planning stage. Ask them what is needed. Okay, well done. All right, let me see if I can get my screen back. All right, let me tell you a little bit about disability inclusiveness in Ukraine now. What we know about 112 in Ukraine is that since martial law was declared, it did not stop or slow down growth around emergency comms in Ukraine. Excuse me, I have a slur as part of my disability, so if the captions don't understand me, please let me know. A single number for 112 was created as a central point for all services, and communication centers based in Kiev, Lviv, and Dnipro were developed that would serve the other regions. Now, we don't always have access across the entire country. My colleagues inside Ukraine tell me that the services are not yet available across the country, but there are plans to roll it out everywhere. Okay? That's us, the picture on the right. I hope you enjoy that. That's what a shelter, that's what a bunker in Kiev looks like if nobody's ever seen one. All right. So what did they do? What do we know about it? They have 112 has SMS messages. We have outgoing calls. We also have the possibility to call 112 Ukraine from abroad. This has been exceptionally useful when perhaps a family member has migrated to Hungary and is on a call with someone, or is maybe able to sign language with someone inside Ukraine. And then they're able to call 112 on behalf of that person if that person is injured or that person is unable to call 112 for themselves. So that is a fantastic development that is actually being well used. 911 is being redirected to 112, which I know many of you do. Geolocation being default activated on calls. And that the operators actually responding to 112 have air shelters, and that these are safe, good quality air shelters so that there's a continuity of services. Not something that I guess many countries are thinking about, but I think if we're going to learn from Ukraine, I think these are the important things to remember. All right. So, what other effective steps have we seen from Ukraine? There's been a policy to hire persons with disabilities and veterans in the call center. There's a workstation for video and audio calling, so staff can use Ukrainian Sign Language with people who are deaf or hard of hearing that use sign language. And I think an interesting number is that over 21,000 calls were made requesting sign language interpreters in a 16-month period. So if you take away anything from this hour, I would say that that number is much higher than most people would estimate. In only 16 months, over 21,000 calls requesting sign language. And then a fantastic innovation, which is incredible for me. I don't know if your countries are doing it, but there is integration between the emergency response services and Ukraine's documentation bureaus. So, for example, if a shahed has destroyed your house, or a falling debris has destroyed your documents, immediately at the site of an attack, the documentation bureau arrives, they start to process your ID, the disability card, etc., to provide you with a new one as soon as possible. Okay? Let me tell you a little bit about emergency notification, what we know about it in Ukraine. And you'll find it maybe interesting that behind these people here, I think that was Cherkasy, behind them, there is actually memorabilia that people keep from the war. It's a habit amongst Ukrainians to keep memorabilia to keep them motivated. All right, emergency notification. Very quickly, after February 2022, various apps were developed to alert the public of incoming attacks. You might have heard about the shield that exists over Kiev or the counter attack measures that Ukraine uses. Lots of places they don't have that, so they really try to get as many people as possible down into shelters or down into basements, for example, to minimize injuries and deaths. The Ukrainian government responded very, very quickly. They worked with some Ukrainian private companies, and they launched their app at the beginning of March, which is really impressive, I think. The disability inclusiveness that we see, it's got push-based alerts, it's very loud, it's got visual notifications, and it's very, very persistent, which is good for people who are perhaps hard of hearing or deaf. It has vibration options, and that's it. And then since December 2024, in an attempt to assist people who have mental health disabilities as a result of the war, at the end of an alert, when the alert time ends, that actually sends you a "How are you" message, and that "How are you" message links through to mental health and psychosocial services, encouraging people to get support for their mental health and psychosocial needs, which is also amazing. Okay, the ability to tone down the alerts is not what it would necessarily be ideally. There is no easy language mode, and there is no what to do next button, which would be ideal for persons with disabilities. And there is no profile adaptation that allows you to mark your disability status and what that disability status is. So, for example, in an app, you might say, well, I have a disability, is that I'm a wheelchair user, and that it would automatically change, for example, the communications to you, or the alerts or the information, or the way that you would call through to 112 if you did. All right. Room for growth, and I'm smiling now because this family on the right actually is a fantastic family I met in Ukraine, where actually that lady in the yellow shirt, I think 3 of those children are her birth children, and all of the rest are children with disabilities that she has fostered and adopted. So she puts a smile on my face, that couple. So room for growth, more space for more kids. There was little to no consultation with persons with disabilities and OPDs in the development of the 112 in Ukraine. We encourage that you do that. Like I said earlier, it's not actually available in reality across the whole country. And then I want to speak to you a little bit about the sound of it. alarms, drones, etc. I will send you this PowerPoint afterwards, or Peter will share it, but I don't want to trigger you because the sound file from the war in Ukraine is quite intense for people who maybe haven't been there like I have. It might upset you. So I definitely want to warn you before you just go and open it. But it's there in the PowerPoint if you would like to get an understanding. A lot of the noises and sounds in Ukraine are very, very high, very, very loud. And I have some numbers for you if one of those, some of you are taking notes. So, for example, after an explosion, we're looking at an explosion that's usually about 120 to 150 decibels. At 120, we usually have pain in our ears. It may or may not damage your ear. At 130 to 140, you will definitely have some ringing in your ears. At 140 up, you might have eardrum rupture. So these things lead to muffled hearing that can be temporary for a couple hours, can be a couple days or even weeks. It might lead to permanent hearing loss. My point is that when we talk about the necessity for emergency communications to be accessible to deaf people, most people who are within a particular radius of such a thing as a shahed or drone explosion will not be able to hear in the immediate minutes, maybe half an hour, maybe days after such an event. And so this is something that we really need to know, understand, and respond to. Okay, so the questions in the chat that will come to at the end. Okay. There, in the chat, can you give me some answers? Why would disability inclusive emergency communications be good for people without disabilities? Can you guys give me some ideas of why that might be important? Anybody? No ideas? Aha, thank you, Peter. Good one. Yes, Liz, absolutely. You know, people who are able-bodied can walk up ramps as well. So when we build a ramp, it doesn't stop people with legs from entering a building. It's called universal design. Absolutely. Thank you, Monica. It enriches communication for people without disabilities, especially in that aftermath, like I just spoke about. Other reasons? So, for example, when somebody is in a war or conflict situation, they might temporarily not have the use of their hands. This might be something that happens. They might have broken legs, broken hands. These are the kinds of things that give them these physical disabilities that are permanent in other people, but might be temporary for them. We would hope that our 112 emergency comms would be accessible. There are people who take medication so that they can get sleep, especially in the situation of war. A lot of people are taking calming medications, sleeping medications. So having something that we can adjust the noise levels. People who are deeply, deeply asleep, it's the same as people who are deaf. And so vibration, for example, might be important. People who are in loud environments. Imagine you're in a nightclub, yes, because some of the nightclubs still continue in Ukraine. It's important to be able to have these alerts. Foreign language speakers would be better off with universally accessible emergency communications. The other thing that happens is that we all experience stress. I've been to Ukraine, I don't know how many times now. And I can tell you something, when it's all happening, when you hear the missiles coming in, your stress goes up, your ability to process information, your ability to think clearly, you really do need something in plain language. So the response for persons with intellectual disabilities, the plain language, the clear language, the short, simple language, is exactly what actually all of us need. And repeating those messages. The other thing that can help everybody is that when you have a faster evacuation, because everybody understands what to do, it saves everybody's lives. If everybody gets into a shelter quickly, this is very important for everybody, not just persons with disabilities. All right. So, persons with intellectual disabilities, I really want to emphasize this bit because I think sometimes it is forgotten how important this is. And especially what I just said, is that we all kind of need this extra support in an emergency. They need to be clear, predictable, and supportive. Loudness and speed seems to always be prioritized, but in fact, that's not necessarily the ideal. We really need, as the people who are in those stressful environments, to have a very clear understanding of what is happening, what it means, and what we should do next. This is for information coming towards us. So what we call plain language, simple words, short sentences, one instruction at a time. What is happening? Is it dangerous? Because in some circumstances it's not. And what should I do right now? So it's important that people understand what kind of threat is occurring, because depending on the threat, you may or may not go to a shelter. Okay. Yes, okay. So let me give you some concluding thoughts. There's 100 million people in Europe who have a disability. Those are very high numbers. And as Europe also tends to have an older population and older people tend to get disabilities, or we tend to increase our number of disabilities as we age, this is a large number. It's important to remove these barriers. It's not just a nice, kind thing to do. It's actually a legal obligation. It's a matter of human rights, and it's a matter of non-discrimination and safety for everybody. So that's important for us to remember. And this idea that we'll do it if it becomes an issue. So this idea that we'll not preparing ahead of time, I would really, really warn against it. And then the last one that I keep saying, which is consult with persons with disabilities, so that what you put in place is actually applicable, useful, quality, etc. And then on your right there is a wonderful example of tactile paving, what we call tactile paving. I'm sure you're all familiar with it. And this is tactile paving gone wrong. When somebody installed tactile paving, best intentions, and kudos for that, but not consulting with persons with disabilities. And it actually makes no sense. It's not helpful to persons with disabilities. Okay. So these are some of my questions to you. I don't know if we want to discuss it, but my first thought would be, do we have an urgent attitude, or do we think that this is something that we can do later? Second is, are we collecting data and analyzing the number of calls from persons with disabilities and the barriers that they're encountering? Are we collecting data, for example, on the number of times that persons with disabilities call on behalf of somebody who doesn't have a disability, like Peter mentioned? Are we collecting any of that data and working with it? Are we planning for accessibility of 112 when mobile networks are overloaded or partially unavailable? Do we have alternatives to that? And then, for example, Ukraine has done a phenomenal job. I don't want to take away from that. They have really done a phenomenal response in in difficult circumstances. But the UNCRPD committee found that there is a lack of accessibility in their emergency and evacuation plans and shelters and emergency infrastructure. So the question would be, would your country also be flagged in your review? Okay, so that's it from me. Should I leave the questions up?
Perfect. So while people are thinking about their questions, I might just make a quick comment. One really important, we discussed other use cases of accessibility features. One really interesting example of of an accessible feature for people with disabilities, which has a lot of benefits. Sorry, apologies, is video call. So video call, of course, was initially meant to help people with disabilities, but in practice, we've seen that it provides a lot of contextual information for other types of emergency communications. Great example of this is a fire. Apparently, it's extremely difficult for people to describe a fire if they're not working in emergency services. Is it big? Is it small? Every opinion is different. Also, our accessibility report card, we'll be publishing this the 11th of February, and everyone in the ESSN and everyone who's a member of ENA can view this. We'll give an overview of the state of accessible emergency communications across Europe. So put that in your calendar. It'd be very interesting to read. One thing that I find really interesting, Philippa, when we discussed in December and as well now, is this concept of accessible public warning. Maybe for other people it was very obvious, but I'd never really thought about it before. And you mentioned some solutions that might vibrate, etc., for people with disabilities. One kind of question I have is you might not always have your phone in your hand or pressed against your body or something. So how or is there a solution to make sure that people with disabilities can hear, well, not hear, but be aware of public warnings, even if, for example, their phone's in a different room, or is this just something that people are still struggling to resolve?
So we have a number of different options. Smartwatches on an individual basis is a very obvious way of ensuring that individuals who are deaf or hard of hearing can have a vibration on their watch. So, for example, I have a heart condition, and when it starts to happen, my watch warns me because it has a heart monitor on it. Very similar things where you can be set to have alerts, but on your smartwatch, and it's a very simple, affordable option for us to make sure that persons with disabilities have those kinds of alerts. We also have lights, so you'll also find that in schools, for example, people who are blind in the blind schools, they will often have lights turning rather than sirens going off, or both, usually both. So lights and vibration are common solutions.
Okay, that's really interesting to hear, and I see more of a statement than a question that indeed video calls are especially helpful in identifying where people are, especially if they're not from the area and they have difficulty explaining where they are, perhaps if they don't speak the language. I think that's a really good point. We did some work on this topic recently, and there really are a lot of other use cases, and there's a lot of people who can struggle to communicate, including indeed tourists. That's another example of people who might, for example, find it easier to communicate by text rather than in their own language. As an example, I can read French, I can type in French. When someone speaks French to me, it might as well be Greek. So
Yeah.
that's another great example of how solutions for people with disabilities, as you said, are like a ramp that help everyone. Um,
Absolutely, absolutely. It's not going to hold anybody else back. I'm not sure how that would even be possible. None of the inclusions actually cause exclusion for people, almost never. And this is why, we have this concept of universal design, which is taken off in so many different sectors, whether it's building or technology or anything else. So yeah. What else can we go through? First, I see there's a wonderful link to someone. I would definitely look at that list. Thank you for that. Is 112 Ukraine participating in the European PSAP? I think Peter would be better placed to know that than me, but I don't think so. But to my knowledge, no.
So my understanding, I know that European legislation is what asked to have this established. So all EU member states may include the long number of their PSAP in that directory. It's currently being run by the CEPT. If I get that wrong, someone tell me, but I'm pretty sure it is. It's my understanding that non-EU countries aren't included in that database. But I didn't answer earlier because I wasn't sure if in practice
Mhm.
maybe Ukraine is a member. But it may be.
It would be something that would happen at accession, I would imagine, if the Ukraine joins the EU. But these things can be quite fluid. I know that Ukraine is bundled in as under the what they call the Eastern Neighborhood in many of these initiatives that exist as a means of trying to get the candidate countries, the countries that are trying to join the EU. Many of them are in some of these spaces. But yeah.
Perfect. Well, I gave my answer. Indeed, CPT is a wider institution, but I wasn't sure if other countries. Indeed, it does appear that some other non-EU countries are in the PSAP directory. We aren't sure if Ukraine is part of the PSAP directory, but it is capable of joining that directory. And we'll look into that actually. It's something we should look into ourselves and make sure it is included. And as a small spoiler for those of you who'll be attending our webinar, I think Thursday on the Digital Networks Act, one of the interesting recommendations of the European Commission in that act is that EU member states should have to include their number on that directory, whereas currently it's not mandatory. So currently several countries haven't put a number in that directory, even though it's very useful for international emergency communications. If I may, I don't know if there's been any other questions, and that's okay. It means it was a very informative webinar. I think something that's really important to take away from this webinar, that I really think we should all consider is that when it was faced with a severe crisis and limited resources, very limited resources, Ukraine prioritized accessibility. Sometimes in recent conversations that we've had with decision makers at a national and European level, with some decision makers, an argument is being made that we can't afford to improve accessibility or other kind of quality of service obligations because now we need to focus on competitiveness and ensuring resilience. And I really think, and this came across quite strongly in our event in December, Ukraine shows the opposite is true um, for all the reasons you discussed. And I think for
Yeah.
all of us, when we're having discussions with decision makers, maybe in our own countries, maybe with our bosses, etc., Ukraine is a very good example that we can use to call for more accessibility. Because indeed, it is difficult to argue that we should deprioritize accessibility because it's too expensive, etc., even though it's not so expensive.
Mm.
Because now we need to be resilient instead and focus on that. When Ukraine, which if any country, if that was true, could afford to cut corners as Ukraine. Ukraine is prioritized and brought in solutions which aren't available in most European countries.
Yeah. I think it's incredible that in their situation they've been able to do so much and they have really set a good practice, a fantastic good example. And if it's helpful to any of you, I'm available to discuss further in more detail. I'm not an emergency comms expert by any means, but I really did want to share what we're seeing in Ukraine, what we're hearing from Ukraine, and the improvements that they've made. But yeah, like Peter says, it's not a competitive issue; it's an inclusion issue, and it really is to the advantage of everybody.
Indeed, absolutely. And there's other examples today, like for example, the idea that people can have temporary disabilities due to, for example, the noise of a bomb strike, which I'll be using in my future discussions. I think I think that's all we have for today. I don't see any more questions. I'd really like to thank you for taking the time to discuss this. I know our members are very grateful. I see a few thank yous in the conversation. And indeed,
Okay.
if anyone has any questions on this, please feel free to reach out to us or indeed to Philippa, as she's so kindly offered to work with other people on this topic. And thank you all again for joining. This will be available online. If you missed some notes, or for example, as is likely the case, it transpires that I spoke too quickly for people to understand. You can also, if you want to learn more about these conversations or about 112, we have our conference, of course, from the 15th of the 17th of April, 2026 in Riga, Latvia. So there's a link in chat for you to find out more and register. But I think that's pretty much all there is today. So I hope you all have a nice afternoon and thank you again, Philippa, for taking the time to
Thank
discuss
you,
this
Peter,
topic.
and thank you, Sana. It's fantastic.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.